And I'm on the tail end of it, but it's still got me a little bit. This reading from Mark, on this day where we celebrate the baptism of Jesus, is the community's first expression of why baptism is even important or meaningful and why it becomes the initiation ceremony of the church. Mark is our earliest gospel writer. And so when he writes, he's fairly close, not only to the events, but he's close to how the very first and earliest community understood those events. Now, those events, as even now, continue to get interpreted and added layers of meaning within their historic context of every generation. But with Mark, he does something here that really emphasizes the wildness of this rite, of what's happening here. A couple of pieces of context. The early community understood that John was a very important figure in the transformation movements that were happening. There were many kinds of movements happening simultaneously in the culture of that time that were all pressing back on the corruption happening within the Jewish hierarchy and society because it was aligned with the Roman society and the political oppression therein. So the movements all share in common a resistance to what was happening in Roman occupation. But they varied in terms of their willingness to be violent and perpetrate violence. There were, at one extreme, the sons of the Iscariot. They would have been understood as highly trained militant people who specifically were about the business of assassination of leadership, who they felt were corrupt. Now, does that sound familiar to you? Okay? Specialized forces of some kind. And the belief is, among some scholars, that Judas was actually a member of the Iscariot, which is where he gets his number, Judas Iscariot, of the sons of Iscariot. If that's so, then the fact that Jesus is really ready to go into his peace movement, ready to be transformed into that movement. The other thing, on the other side of the spectrum, in the middle first, are people who are really kind of pressing. There have already been Jewish revolts earlier, and later, after the fall of the temple, there are more. So there's also a group that's looking for social transformation that looks very much like tearing down what exists. And then on the spectrum, which Jesus and John represent, it is a transformation of thoughts and heart. And John was the forerunner and the most powerful and most well-known of the people who are criticizing the status quo, highly and boldly criticizing the Roman Empire and people in power, criticizing openly Herod, and criticizing openly the Sanhedrin and others from the temple precinct who had been corrupt. So in this kind of open criticism, you can imagine he's very vulnerable to being assassinated himself. When he's out there, he is having all these symbols that John applies to him that basically tells us how disconnected he is from getting caught up in all of that stuff. That he has laid aside any things that any pieces of power and authority that he could have rightly said were his. He was, after all, as I mentioned other times, the son of a prominent high priest, and could have, by blood, had the rights to have access to the Holy of Holies and become a priest in there himself. But he sets all that aside. He sets any prestige aside. He sets aside even his dependence on the very society which he's critiquing. He sets aside his dependence on that marketplace. Notice how he's not eating domesticated honey because honey was a market. He's eating wild honey. He's out in the wilderness collecting the honey. He's eating locusts. That certainly isn't a delicacy on the Roman table. actually have a lot of protein. And if you see one of those weird survival shows, you'll see that people will eat grubs and locusts and all that. Poor little kid. He stayed actually forever, and he must have the same grub. The piece of it that John is also having is, of course, he's wearing these wild clothes, right? And again, not relying on any domestic market for that. He's wearing the skins. All of this is to show how what he's doing is so countercultural, because even the cleansing, ritual cleansing through water, was a very common motif, but it would have been done near or in those temple precincts as a ritual bath called a mikvah, to be able to be ritually purified before you enter the temple. Or after you've done all kinds of things in life that you might have gotten exposed to something considered taboo. And so these mikvahs were very common, but the fact that he's using this at the River Jordan, a symbol itself for freedom, and it's the last thing that happens when they enter the promised land. The Israelites cross over the River Jordan. And he is, in a sense, kind of reclaiming that history, re-evoking this idea of freedom in a very powerful way, and in the face of the Roman occupation. His followers were all about wanting social transformation in a way that was vocal, that was seeable, but that was persistent and nonviolent. They would speak the truth. They wouldn't be afraid to do that, but they wouldn't be co-opted into violence. And so they're coming to him. They are accepting this invitation to the wilderness, to coming outside that domestic and walled sphere of the city, to where he gets to find him. And we hear that Jesus is among those who respond. So even to show up at that is rather threatening when it becomes in large numbers to the people who are observing this happening. And if you think even today we get worried about large demonstrations of people, whether it's Occupy Wall Street or some other movement, or even what's happening now in Paris, it's the voice of the people when movements like this happen. And the only way to put that down is for the other side to escalate to even greater violence. But ultimately, ideas cannot be killed. And we see that because we have a 2,000-year-old tradition. The idea of peace and being initiated into speaking the truth, power, is an old idea. But it's something that we promised to do when we got baptized. That would be our turning as well. We would accept the invitation to wilderness, to freedom, to challenging wherever we see injustice. It's a part of our walk. It feels very political, and it is. If you're hoping that your church experience won't bring politics into play, you're going to be very disappointed. Because it really does involve that. Now, when Jesus accepts this invitation, John up until then had really been seen as the movement's leader. So much so that we have this confusion when people say that they got baptized by John, so they were baptized into his philosophy, into his movement. They were followers of John. And when Jesus comes, then the whole thing shifts after John is killed. Because people want to know, we were his followers, what do we do now, what do we follow now? And the idea of what happened there at the Jordan with baptism has to change. You weren't baptized to be followers of John. You were baptized to be followers of the one who came after him. The one that he says was even greater than himself. The one he was setting the way for. You were baptized into Jesus. So this moment when Jesus is being baptized and he comes up from this wild water and we hear this voice from heaven, the first thing that happens, did you catch that? That heaven is ripped asunder, ripped apart. Heaven is ripped open. That somehow even the last barrier, whether it's ritualistic, as they had in Hebrew law, whether it's a wall around the empire, the last barrier is taken down dramatically by God. Heaven is ripped asunder. And God reaches out and says, this is my son. With this last barrier broken, true direct relationship with God. Being baptized into Christ, they are intended to follow in that intimate relationship with God. That the words that come to God, to Jesus, that say, "You are my Son in whom I am well pleased." Because all followers are then baptized into that baptism. We are to understand the same message. We are children of God, in whom God is well pleased. This isn't just meant to be an affirming statement, like pushing the like button on Facebook. I like you. This is meant to be a radical acceptance. That no matter what you've ever done, no matter what you will do, no matter what challenges you face, no matter what happens to you or is perpetrated to you, no matter what you think, no matter how you identify, you are my child in whom I am well pleased. God says this to Jesus before he goes out into the desert and has some meditations about what he should do with the ministry of his own baptism. To put himself at further risk when he's seen what has happened to John. It would be very tempting to not take up that leadership. And it continues to be tempting, I think, to us as Christians who are dedicated to peace and struggle with how to engage conflict when it arises. How to get in the midst of where we're invited into justice issues, into naming the wrongs, into going into places that are wounded and threatening and dangerous, and offering healing and restoration. That's a challenging piece for us, but we ought not to mistake that our ideals around wanting to have peace should be confused with understanding what we ought not tolerate. That tolerance is value unless tolerance itself becomes a passive okay. That it's okay. But to intervene in some way. And by voice, most of all. I remember when I was a child, about maybe 3 or 4, and I loved the rain. And I would go out in my little raincoat that my mom gave me, and I would stand underneath one of our broken gutters. Like a good 3 or 4-year-old would do, right? And I love the sensation of this torrent of water coming down over my head. It was just amazing. And really getting into that, to the point where my mother would meet me at the door with towels. And she knew that I was having this experience. An experience of nature where I felt very connected to that. And it was a joyful experience. And it was even more joyful because at the end of it, I knew that my mother would be waiting for me with that towel to enfold me with her love and warmth and to help dry me on. And then I could do that again and again, and she would be there. This is a message to us in our baptism, truly. It's meant to be a joyful thing, an experience that brings this new creation that's imaged in our readings, whether it's from Genesis or from Paul. He's making something new, a new discipleship out of another 12. That our traditions are not meant to stymie us from moving into new places and new expressions and change. That in fact, that is part of what is wild about the water. That it is always flowing and always taking us, even against our will, into new waters, into new places. In a little while, we'll hear in our annual meetings and ideas coming up for 2015 and beyond. Wild waters. That will require the same faith and persistence and dialogue as a community that may even feel at times like death of what was, so that we can make room for new life and what will yet be. But in all those things, God is with us. And if it feels scary, like heaven is being rendered asunder, then we're doing it right. Because we have to break down those barriers, even in our own hearts and minds, and between one another, so that we can be truly what